Hello and welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I am of course your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 170th episode, our guest is Thomas Frank. Thomas Frank is the author of Listen Liberal, Pity the Billionaire, The Wrecking Crew, and What's the Matter with Kansas? A former columnist for the Wall Street Journal and Harper's, Frank is the founding editor of The Baffler and writes regularly for The Guardian. He lives outside Washington, D.C. His new book, The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism, was published Tuesday. And now on to the show. Been a long time coming. I've read a lot of your work in the time.
Is that right?
Oh yeah, awesome. Absolutely. So I'm very familiar. I'm a big fan. And
now, can you hear me all right?
Yes. Yeah, you sound
I've got
great.
this weird headset where I can't hear my own voice, and it's really annoying to me.
I can hear you just fine. So yes, thank you so much for doing this and taking the time. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
So for people who don't know, could you tell a little bit about yourself? Just introduce yourself.
Oh, yeah. So I am a writer and I guess you'd say a journalist. Used to be. Well, I don't want to say I used to be a historian because I never really was. I mean, I have a PhD and all that, but I'm not. I've never been a professor at a university.
Well, I've learned a lot from your books. Yeah, you write a lot about history, so give yourself credit. I think you're a historian. So, I learn a lot from your work. So, yeah. So let's see. The first book I read of yours was just want to start there because I have to. What's the Matter with Kansas? And such a great idea for a book. Just right off the bat. You're obviously from Kansas. I'm from Indiana.
I'm not only from Kansas. I'm in Kansas right now.
No kidding. Wow. Okay. See, I thought you'd be like ensconced in like some, coastal place right now. So.
Well, I live in my family and I live in the suburbs of Washington, but I've come out here to be with my dad during the COVID, during the epidemic.
Right. Definitely. Well, is everyone safe and healthy, I hope?
Oh yeah, we're being very careful.
Okay.
He's 91.
Oh my gosh.
So we have to be real careful.
Absolutely. Well, good. That's good to hear. Well, I'm in Indiana, born here, raised here, lived in California for a couple of years, and England for a couple of months. But other than that, pretty much my whole life in Indiana. So
Indiana, it's a vertical Kansas. It's just the same
vertical
thing.
Kansas, I love it.
It's the same thing flipped on its side,
Yes, I would agree, very much so. But yeah, so I relate a lot to your work on that level. It is interesting how you set everything up because going back even further, when I first read Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, one of the most shocking facts to me was that the hotbed of socialists and I think it was like the highest number of registered like socialists in America was per capita was Oklahoma.
That's right. And there were some of them were actually famous. There was a newspaper editor from some town in Oklahoma who was nationally known. He was a respected guy. It's all that memory is, it's all been wiped clean. But even before that, Kansas was synonymous with radicalism. This is where John Brown made his name, and then where the Populist Party got its start. And I was reading it. Well, you've read The People Know, but one of the little strange little anecdotes that I tell in there is this short story by Kipling, who lived in America in the 1890s, and he tells this story about horses on a farm. The horses can talk, and we can listen to them, and it's like Orwell's Animal Farm, only with the reversed politics. And the horses are all hardworking. They know their place. They're sort of like ideal proletarians, right? And then a horse from Kansas shows up, and he's like this born troublemaker, and he's spouting all of this kind of Jeffersonian French Revolution kind of rhetoric, and the other horses hate him.
Right. That's so interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, Indiana's kind of the same way too, in that, this is where Eugene V. Debs is from, Kurt
That's right.
Vonnegut. Some of the greatest humanists and socialists we've ever seen on the face of the earth come from my neck of the woods. But you wouldn't know that, looking at the
It's
electoral
all
map
gone.
these days. But
Exactly.
we'll get to that eventually, I'm sure. But the idea that you have, if I may be so bold as to summarize your work a little bit, you basically say that in one of your points is that the modern Republican Party has adopted the language of the working class socialist of yore, but they've reappropriated it from an economic message into a cultural message. Like the battlefield is now cultural, and we feel that same. Which side are you on? Or which side are you on, brother?
Yeah, I know, but it's just like it's like in your face today.
Yeah.
It's so massively annoying, and Trump at first seemed to be sort of pushing the boundaries of that formula. And he was promising in 2016 that he was going to do all of this great stuff for working people, and he did none of it. I mean, it's just culture war, right? It's just like this new and even more insane culture war than ever before. It's just like, good Lord, we've made the epidemic into a culture war. Like what?
Amazing.
What kind of who does that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like I used to say, if something cataclysmic happened, it was like the meteor's coming. We got to get everyone together to fight it. Like maybe that would bring us all together, but I don't even know if that's true anymore. Like I feel like it would still be politicized, like meteor, fake news.
Yeah, it's just crazy. Anyhow, that's where we are.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, for sure. But yeah, that was a great book. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, you definitely, like you said, there's a real radical past that we shouldn't be so quick to forget about. And it's kind of like the middle of the country. It's very much like this tug of war. It's like you said, it's bloody Kansas. People rushing there to assert whatever. And I feel like such a tension in the middle of the country. Don't you? I mean, there's such a
today on my daily bike ride. I did see a guy drive by in a pickup truck flying an enormous Blue Lives Matter flag. Yeah.
Wow.
And yeah. And of course it was a pickup truck, and
of course.
And as I was riding through a fairly affluent suburb of Kansas City, and in all the yards of the affluent homes were little Black Lives Matter. The signs, right? So, so there's your there's your upside down, political culture war of our time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like you say, it's all symbolic victories. None of this means anything. It's just all in our minds.
I know. Yeah. Right. Except for the poor guy that gets killed by the cop, right? That,
Of course. Absolutely. Yeah. No doubt.
And also, I mean, the idea of making the coronavirus into let's not talk about this. It just makes me mad.
That's okay.
I mean, this is what they're going to learn, right? This is Trump is going to go down so hard I shouldn't say that either, because who the hell knows?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, absolutely. But to get into let's get to a more fun topic, your new book. People know. Yeah, I just finished it tonight. So yeah, it's fresh in my mind. And it's very interesting because it talks about the word populism in a way that I kind of hope that people think more deeply about that term than I think people usually do. There's a very knee-jerk definition of what it means, and it has a very specific meaning in history, and it's kind of gotten perverted over time. So
yes, and I thought, I started out with this book just I was just going to tell the sort of my personal understanding of what populism is and how it developed. And I did tell that story in the book. But what was far more interesting to me was what you just described. How did the word come off the rails? Mm-hmm. How did populist, and I traced, by the way, where it was invented, where the word was invented. It's about, 20 miles from where I'm sitting right now. Mm-hmm. Some guys on a train between Kansas City and Topeka came up with this word. But how did this word go from meaning, the left-wing radical farmer labor party of their day, the good guys, to meaning, right-wing demagogues, racist would-be dictators. How the hell did that happen? And that history became far more interesting to me. And I've been rereading the book the last few days, and it just jumps out at me. It's really an amazing story how that came to pass. But today, if you open up your New York Times or your Washington Post, that's how the word is used. It's just used, as though there was no problem with that, as though that, that was perfectly acceptable to a populist is Trump.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess I didn't realize that it was a capital P populist party at one point, proper noun, actually existed as a party. I guess I just didn't put that together. I always thought it was just kind of something you called somebody. I didn't never think it had any basis in that, but it did. It was a very real, like you said, was concerned with the actual what the people, like on a real economic level, not just
right. And they don't. Yeah. And there's historians have studied populism. I mean, there's so many works on uppercase P populism, the people who made up the word, and I mean. Long story short, none of the stereotype of today, it doesn't apply to them. I mean, almost none of it. Very limited pieces here and there, but it basically has nothing to do with them. What happened was there was a famous historian in the 1950s who was frightened by McCarthyism and decided to use the name of the Populist Party and make it into a generic term for what was wrong with working class movements. That were all working class movements were essentially were like McCarthyism. They were authoritarianism waiting to happen, and he succeeded. His redefinition of the term took off, and his work was later, I mean, not all that long later, like 5 years later, was just massively refuted. Other historians went and checked everything, and he was wrong on just about every count. It was extraordinary. He was massively disproven. But here's what's weird, Rob. That didn't make any difference. His sort of reconfiguration of populism, it stuck in people's minds, and it carried the day. And you got to this point like 10 years later where Europeans have never heard of the Populist Party from Kansas in the 1890s. They've never heard of that. All they know is this redefinition of the word, where it means like basically fascist. And so that's how they used it, and they got it from this American historian who did this deliberately for reasons that I speculate on in The People Know. Anyhow, fascinating story. It's really interesting.
But it was interesting.
Can I tell you why I think it's so important?
Absolutely.
Why it's so interesting? Because what this historian did in the 50s. I should tell you his name, by the way. His name was Richard Hofstadter.
Okay, I thought that's who you were talking about, but I thought maybe I missed it, because he wrote The Paranoid Style in American Politics, which is what I knew him from previously. The object in this book is to sort of reverse his worldview. So interesting. Now I got to go read that now. I haven't read that yet. So
yeah, well, I was, when I was younger, I was inspired by Hofstadter. He's the greatest writer of American history that the greatest writer among American historians ever. It's amazing.
So you still think his work is worthwhile, even though?
Yes. Absolutely. Yes. He was obsessed with populism, though, and. Wait, look, let me put it this way. There is a paranoid style.
Yeah, that's why I was always interested in that book. I was like, yeah, that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it exists. It exists. And there were people who were associated with populism who fit that definition. But here's the funny thing, like it was an enormous movement. It had millions and millions of people involved in it, there's only a handful of them that fit that definition. And at the same time, there were plenty of Republicans that were, part of the paranoid style too. To try to single out populists as the bearer of it is ridiculous. But the idea itself is true. I mean, yeah, there is a paranoid style. It's really interesting to trace it. And Anyhow, but here's why it's important. Hofstadter was not a conservative. Hofstadter was a liberal, and liberals listened to him. He was one of the leading liberals of his day, as a matter of fact. And his great student was another liberal, Christopher Lasch. And people listened to Hofstadter, and Hofstadter drove a wedge between liberalism and the working class. And this was just the beginning of that, right? In the old days, liberalism was always identified with the aspirations of working people. That's what liberalism was, and it came from populism. And Hofstadter started to drive a wedge between liberals and the working class. And that continued and continued and continued till you get down to the present day, where you've got, the Democratic Party having basically turned its back on its previous identity. I mean, they're reversing course a little bit now, with Joe Biden. But you look at the Clintons, you look at Obama, you look at, who the Democratic Party is today, and they are Richard Hofstadter's creation. It's quite amazing.
Yes. Okay. Well, that is interesting because going back to the original populist party, one of their planks was, and I had heard this speech because when I was in elementary school, I had a CD-ROM of famous speeches, and one of the speeches on the CD-ROM was the Cross of Gold speech.
Yes.
So I was familiar with that, but I had no idea what the context was. I just knew that speech, and I was like, wow, this guy he's fired up about this gold thing.
So that's very interesting. So that was there's a whole chapter in the book about that. That guy's name was William Jennings Bryan. Yes. He wasn't actually a populist. He was a Democrat, but he was from Nebraska, which was a populist state. And Bryan talked like a populist. And the populists in Nebraska and around the country really liked him. He was the sort of left wing of extreme left edge of the Democratic Party in 1896. And they go to have their convention. Just tell me when you want me to shut up, by the way, because I know you know all this.
No, this is for the people. We're populists here.
Yeah.
Right.
The Democrats in 1890, the country's in a deep depression in the early 1890s. And there's been huge strikes. Eugene Debs, this enormous strike out of Chicago, the railroad strike. There were other strikes as well. There was a march the first ever march on Washington by an army of the unemployed. The populists organized that. It was called Coxey's Army. All this stuff was going on. And the president of the United States is a Democrat. It's Grover Cleveland, and he is committed to the gold standard. And the gold standard, this is how the currency was based on gold. The dollar was worth a certain amount of gold. And the problem with the gold standard is it was deflationary. So the economy would grow, the population would grow, and the amount of dollars in circulation would not grow. And this was extremely bad for working people and farmers. And it also meant that you couldn't do any of the things that we expect government to do now. That they couldn't do any kind of, massive spending on, deficit spending on, internal improvements or road building or infrastructure, any of that. They couldn't do anything like that. They couldn't have a welfare system. You couldn't do anything with the gold standard. And so the populists wanted to replace the gold standard with a silver standard. They called it free silver. And Bryan, here comes William Jennings Bryan. The Democratic Convention in 1896 is in complete turmoil. They have decided to toss out Grover Cleveland. They're not going to endorse their own sitting president. They decided they're turning against the gold standard. They don't want the gold standard. It looks like complete radicalism. And then this guy sweeps the convention with this amazing speech about doing away with the gold standard, and he does it in this sense in which it's all about the working people versus the elite against the bankers, the working people against the East Coast financiers, and that's what the silver standard versus the gold standard was supposed to be. And he sweeps the convention, and the Democrats nominate this guy for president. He was 36 years old. uh, the youngest person ever nominated by a
I'm
major.
36. What am I doing with my life?
I know, it kind of makes you feel a little insignificant, and it's this amazing moment, and the populist party sees this and they say, okay, we're gonna support him also, and so they throw in their support to the Democrats, to William Jennings Bryan, and the Eastern establishment press of this country goes absolutely berserk. And this is all in the People Know. I've got all these great cartoons from that period where they started denouncing Bryan in the most extreme way. There's one where they depict him as Satan.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, they depict him as a Italian immigrant who has assassinated Lady Liberty.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
I love old-timey editorial cartoons. They're the best.
Yeah.
I mean, except when they're incredibly racist.
Yes, exactly. And they went all in on promoting this kind of public hysteria, about they called him an anarchist and a repudiationist. They would always link him with Debs. You mentioned Debs earlier. Sure. Because Debs was a leading populist at the time. And so they would always try to link Bryan with Debs, et cetera, et cetera. And they beat him. The Republicans pulled out all the stops. They raised an enormous treasury, by some respects, the most money ever spent in a presidential election. If you do it as on the per capita basis, the most money ever spent. It dwarfs what they spend today. And they destroyed this guy. William Jennings Bryan. They were just like, we are going to go out and crush idealism in this country. And
exactly.
They did it. And they did it by the way one of the main ways they smeared him was with the word populist. They redefined populist as meaning, anarchy, mob rule, this sort of insane, people rioting in the streets. Populism had to be, they would depict populists getting attacked by police. The idea is that populists are the lower orders and they have to learn their place, on and on and on like this. I call that the democracy scare. This fear, this like great fear among the country's elites that the people were out of control. And the word they used for that was populism. And I've got a whole bunch of, by the way, if you go on my website at tcfrank.com, I've got a whole bunch of these illustrations up there from 1896. They're quite incredible. They're so vicious. And what you see is this democracy scare. This happens again and again in American history. It happened again in the 30s when Roosevelt was president, and the sort of elite of the country, economists, big business, the press, the sort of legal community came together to denounce Roosevelt in exactly the same terms. It was the people were out of control. It was a mob. The New Deal represented the mob. It was the lower orders demanding that that rich people support them. Even though they were supposedly unwilling to work. You see that again, and then you see it again in the 1950s with Richard Hofstadter and his friends, only they reverse the politics of it. And now they say it's professional expertise that the people refuse to accept. It's not, bankers and the sort of the business elite. It's the professional elite. And the problem with populism is that it doesn't respect this elite. So you see the same stereotype going up through the years. It's completely wrong about what populism, the movement, actually was. But the stereotype grows more and more powerful until today, it's just natural, and they apply it to Donald Trump,
Mm-hmm. By the way, John Hay was born like 10 minutes from me in Salem, Indiana.
So he's an interesting figure. John Hay was Lincoln.
I've been to his museum, his childhood home museum. Because I said, it was like in the next county over from where I grew up. So,
but here's a man. By the way, he followed this very interesting trajectory of a great believer in democracy, in mass democracy during the Civil War. He's private secretary to Abraham Lincoln. really believed in the Union cause during the Civil War, and then later on came to believe, I should say, that mass democracy was a problem because it allowed working people to vote, and working people are going to, are always going to outnumber the John Hayes of the world. He somewhere along the way, by the way, he became very wealthy. You know about this, right? Mm-hmm. He married into a very wealthy family and decided that working class people were a problem. And he wrote in 1896. He was a very loyal Republican. He wrote the ultimate denunciation of populism. He was an amazing writer. His command of the English language is it's just wonderful to read. But his politics just got uglier and uglier as he got older.
But anyhow, well, I'm looking at your website now, so I'm seeing these cartoons here. So, yeah, I see that the U.S. credit woman has been stabbed to death on the steps of the U.S. Treasury.
By William Jennings Bryan.
Of course. And we got the devil himself with the wings and all. William Jennings Bryan. Yeah, it's pretty extreme stuff.
Yeah. So a lot of those cartoons, by the way, as far as I can tell, have never been reproduced before. I went out and found them. There's one of the things about this book that was really fun was so I told you I went to graduate school and studied history, got a PhD in history, and I studied populism in graduate school, and it was not easy to do. If you wanted to read, so populists had a lot of newspapers. Every small town in the Midwest had a populist newspaper, and if you want to read those newspapers, it used to be very difficult to do. You had to get the microfilm. They had to send it to wherever you were located, and then you had to sit there and read it very, very slowly on a microfilm reader. And it was really labor intensive to study populism. And now all those newspapers are online. And I was able to do the research for this. It was actually, it was amazing how easy it was. But one of the things I was able to do was get hold of back issues of these political magazines from the 1890s. They're very hard to come by in libraries, but people are forever selling them on eBay. So I went out there and bought a whole bunch of them, and found all this stuff and was able to reproduce it. And it was. The internet has really changed how you do research in a good way, I suppose.
Are these all in the public domain now?
Yes.
Wow, that's amazing. There's got to be
expired from 1896. Yeah.
There's so much beautiful art in magazines and stuff.
Oh yeah, and believe me,
the ads,
they were all drawn by hand and colored, and I'm just scratching the surface with the stuff that I put in here. I put in the most extreme examples, and a lot of the examples I put in there were famous at the time, like the one that shows Brian as Satan.
Right.
People were like, "Oh, I think you've crossed a line there. That's going a little too far. That's blasphemous. But it was never reproduced anywhere that I was able to find. But it was easy to track down the magazine that it appeared in. And
wow. That's really cool. Yeah, that reminds me. I've got a couple Look magazines from the 60s and 70s. Take a look at.
I love that. That was my first book. Was about the advertising industry in the 60s, cool. And the way you do it back. This is when I wrote that book in the 90s. No TV commercials from the 60s were online. YouTube didn't exist. You couldn't look at something like that. So the way you researched it was you got out Life and Look magazines and just went through them. They were the great showplace of American advertising back then.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Well, you were ahead of your time then with the whole Mad Men thing. So
don't even talk to me about that. That's still
oh no, sore subject. Yeah. But going back to the populists again, what else did they stand for besides the gold thing? What were their main tenets? And throughout the book, you also say they were falsely accused of racism and anti-Semitism, but you say that wasn't maybe as big of a deal as people made it out to be.
Right. So populists were obsessively focused on economic issues. So they were by and large a farmer party. They came out of a group called the Farmers Alliance, and the whole program was to rescue farmers from this very bad situation that they were in. So they wanted a government program to give cheap loans to farmers. Farmers at the time were totally under the thumb of bankers. They could not escape their debt. It just got worse and worse every year. This is true in the Midwest and also in the South. And so farmers proposed a government program to give cheap loans to farmers, which that program, something like that actually exists today. They wanted to fix the currency, as I mentioned before, to change get off the gold standard. They wanted to nationalize the railroads because the railroads were a monopoly. So populism, they hated monopoly. So they were always trying to figure out ways to either regulate or nationalize or break up monopolies. And so they wanted to do that. And then they had a bunch of other issues of less importance, less significance. One of the ones that's particularly important today is they were the first big national party that wanted votes for women. And they had, unlike the Democrats and the Republicans at the time, they had a lot of women leaders. So here in Kansas, the sort of preeminent leader of populism was a woman. She was like apparently a spellbinding speaker. There's no recordings of her or anything, but a spellbinding speaker who would go around the state telling farmers to raise less corn and more hell. Yeah, and so they actually succeeded in getting women's suffrage in several states, Colorado and Idaho. I think that was the populists that did that. They were not particularly anti-immigrant. That's often applied to them, but they actually were not that. You can show that pretty definitively. Here in Kansas, there were a lot of immigrants at the time, and populists courted their vote. I mean, they tried really hard to win their vote. And they did. And there's all sorts of immigrants who were members of who were populists and voted for it. And the point that's really what's really awful is the way they got caught up in the race issue in the South. Because they started out with this idea, which was very advanced for its day, that black farmers and white farmers had the same interests in the South and should get together and vote their interests. And there was a group of black populists called the Colored Farmers Alliance. And so this was their initial proposal in the South, was we're going to break with the Democratic Party, which was this monolithic racist structure in the South at the time. We're going to break with the Democratic Party, and we're going to set up this new party that will get the votes of poor whites and black farmers. And at the time, in a lot of southern states, blacks could still vote. And this ended very badly. I don't know if you've read that part of the book where I tell this story, but it's a famous story. It's incredibly awful. The Democrats, faced with being beaten by this third party, and in a lot of the southern states, it looked like populism was going to be very powerful. So the Democrats are faced with this challenge. How are they going to beat it? And the way they beat it was by white supremacy. They rolled out what they called the white supremacy campaign. And it's just, again, this campaign of unbelievable racist hysteria in order to defeat populism. And in North Carolina, the only southern state where populism came out on top was North Carolina. And in North Carolina, the Democrats actually encouraged violence. It did. They had a what do you call it? A campaign of lynching and murder to crush populism, and they did it. And when they were done, they actually excuse me. Oh, there's a podcast. I can say that, right?
You can say anything you want, Thomas Frank.
A mob of Democrats actually overthrew the elected government of a city in North Carolina, of Wilmington, North Carolina, and They called it a race riot, although it was just white Democrats going through the black parts of town shooting people. It was incredible, the stuff that they did. And when they were done, the Democrats prevailed. They got back in power, and they took away the right to vote of black people, and a lot of poor whites too. And they crushed populism forever. They did this in a lot of places in the South. This was a recurring theme in a bunch of different Southern states. And it wasn't, in a lot of places, it wasn't because of populism per se. It was because populism had showed the Democrats that if they continued to let blacks and poor whites vote, that something might happen, that these people might rise up against their system. And so that's where what they call disenfranchisement, that's where it came from. It's the most horrible story. Yeah. And somewhere along the line that story got lost and got forgotten and got turned upside down. And so instead you have people like, what's his name in the 60s, George Wallace, who's just a sort of racist monster, the governor of Alabama. Somebody decides that's the guy who represents populism. And he's on the other side. He's the bad guy, right? But the people are like, no, that's populism is this guy, this right-wing white backlash figure from the late 1960s. And they called him a populist in the 1960s. This is 100 years later, or almost 80 years later, I should say. And yeah, the word got completely inverted. It's just that we live in the strangest world. Yeah, the word got turned on its head.
Well, let's go forward in time a little bit to the 30s and talk about what happened with populism then, because you basically describe in the lead up to the New Deal how the elite they threw everything but the kitchen sink at FDR to try to stop this from happening. It kind of reminds me of the whole thing that's happening now with the unemployment thing, where it's like people get the extra $600 and it's like, well, we can't give this to them anymore. They won't want to work. It's like they're getting paid more now. It's like, well, hold on a second. Maybe you should just pay them this all the time. People can't live.
It's the same thing. But that's so the arguments from the 30s. So part of it is the 30s are the high water mark of populism in America. If you go back and look at Frank Capra movies or Orson Welles movies, or listen to popular music from the time, or look at any kind of cultural ephemera from the 1930s, the sort of what are the social realist novels or WPA murals, or it's extremely populist. It's all the sort of ideas of the People's Party about the nobility of the common man and farmers and workers getting together and all this stuff. That was everywhere in the 1930s. And there's all of these different politicians who embraced it, like the governor of Minnesota at the time, a guy called Floyd Olson, a whole bunch of others. But the preeminent sort of representative of this sensibility was Franklin Roosevelt, who used this kind of really powerful populist style in his speeches, talking about the nobility of ordinary people and the monstrousness of the bankers, the elites. And he did this, of course, to push a very populist program it involved, as we all know, populist agricultural reforms, breaking up monopolies. He didn't nationalize the railroads, but they started to regulate them. Basically the whole populist program. He comes right out of that background. I mean, not personally, but intellectually. And historians at the time in the 30s and 40s very clearly drew the line between Roosevelt and populism. They're like, yeah, Roosevelt is coming right out of the populist tradition. They said this all the time in the 1930s. And then you have this. That's all forgotten today. When again, people think it's Donald Trump. They think that's what the word means, but. There was this backlash against Roosevelt that is absolutely fascinating to me. Again, the book is about not just populism, but about the people who hate it. And there were these sort of the first big right-wing front groups in American history were set up in the 1930s to defeat the New Deal. The main one was called the American Liberty League, and they actually had more money than a political party. They had more money than the Republican Party. And they proceeded to deluge the country and to do exactly what the Republicans had done in the 1890s, to encourage hysteria and deluge the country with these pamphlets and radio speeches and stuff like that, denouncing Roosevelt as a dictator, an autocrat, mob rule. It's, he was like Hitler, he was the leader with his mob, his fanatical mobs. And then also the idea at the same time that the New Deal was supporting all these people who refused to work. And that was the real problem of the Depression, is that people refused to work, and we had to make them work. They should not be trying to, to leech off of the rich by making the rich pay taxes. Soak the rich was the phrase at the time. And the other element of this, again, this is a democracy scare, same as in the 1890s, a democracy scare. And the other element of it was the press. The press in this country despised Franklin Roosevelt in this way that, again, is very difficult to comprehend today. The Chicago Tribune every day during the campaign of 1936 would put on the top of the front page in small letters, or maybe it was at the bottom, I forget now, I've got it photographed somewhere, but they would say, you have X number of days to save your country, meaning to vote for the Republican candidate to get Roosevelt out of there. And they attacked him in the most extraordinarily vicious way. It was like what they did to Bryan in 1896. And I include some of those cartoons in the book. They're hilarious now when you look back at them, because Franklin Roosevelt, he's a beloved figure. He's the man on the dime. He's the sort of founder of the welfare state in this country. And of the regulation and all that. And they hated his guts. There's amazing quotes that I was able to find, again thanks to the internet, because all of the American Liberty League stuff is now online. You can look it up very easily. You don't have to go to the library to do it. And it was, these people opposing Roosevelt, again, this was the cream of American society, the very wealthiest people, like the DuPont family, all of the great industrialists, all of the great corporation attorneys, all of the great economists. It was the business and professional elite of this country unanimously despised this guy, and then the newspaper publishers as well. And you go back and read what they actually said about Roosevelt. Just saying they hated him is one thing. Go back and look at the substance of why they hated him. It's incredible. It's their hatred for ordinary people is just poisonous. There's a lot of eugenics mixed in this stuff. That ordinary the reason people were poor was because they had, they'd been selected by nature to be poor. It was in their genes. There was one of these Republicans was like, we shouldn't let poor people reproduce, because if they do, they will eventually be able to outvote us. And take our stuff. And it was just like, it's incredible the stuff that went on in the name of stopping populism, stopping liberalism, racist, openly racist stuff. And of course, needless to say, it didn't work. Roosevelt prevailed.
As soon as people got hold of Social Security and Medicare, it was like, we're not giving this up now. Yeah, right. We've had a taste of it. It's good. We kind of like this. Well, that's like these stimulus checks. They're like, oh man, we can't start giving people money.
By the way, can I just tell you, the one that drives me crazy is universal health care. How come we don't have that? We're in a health crisis like we have never seen before in our history, except for 100 years ago, and we don't have universal health care. What the hell? Skipping way forward in your book, what a time for not
Bernie Sanders to work out, because
No.
he would have been the perfect candidate for right now. And I'm so upset that we missed our chance there with that, because as you say at the end of the book, he is the torchbearer of this, actual for real populism, that we're not talking about the, Trump populism, whatever that is. Okay, what would you call that if not populism, the Trump populism? Would you just demagoguery? Is that as far as it goes?
It is demagoguery. So I encourage people to use a different word for it. Now, the word that I use, I mean, there's a bunch of different words, and some of them are very controversial. But
you say fascist.
I wouldn't say that. I'd say pre-fascist. Pre-fascist. No, he's not. No, he's not. He's not. So a lot of these guys in the 30s, there were a lot of really scary demagogues in the 1930s, and the term that they would use for them, they weren't like someone like Father Coughlin was not a full-on fascist. He was a pre-fascist, or William Randolph Hearst. Both of these guys played footsie with Nazism, and but they were not fascists themselves. They were more like something on the road to fascism. What I call Trump deliberately. What makes Trump interesting, and what's Ronald Reagan before him and George Bush and all of these guys, Richard Nixon, is that they deliberately use workerist language. They deliberately use the language of populism for ends that are the opposite. I mean, you look at Ronald Reagan as the most extreme example, even more so than Trump. Reagan, his administration, they wanted to bring back the gold standard, but he did it while talking about the ordinary people, how he was such great friends with the working class. He's the one that coined this stupid phrase, "Make America Great Again." So I call Trump and Reagan and Nixon pseudo-populists or fake populists, or I mean, in a pinch, you could say right-wing populists, but I don't think that's right, because that implies that they're going at the same goal from a different angle. And Trump obviously is not going at the same goal. He said he was going to, but he's done nothing of the kind. I mean,
no, right.
Yeah. And so these people in Europe, I mean, I don't even know why they apply the term populist to them. They have nothing to do with the tradition of, a farmer labor party. By the way, can I go off on an aside here?
Please do.
So when this whole coronavirus started, the pandemic started, there's this whole narrative now in the Democratic Party and the Washington Post that we have to trust experts. And the great mistake that we're making here is that we're not trusting experts, and that instead we're listening. Populism is killing us, right? Because populism is the ideology that doesn't trust experts. Well, that's not exactly true. The original populists actually did trust certain kinds of experts. But I went back and it made me ask this question. What would a populist healthcare system look like? And so I went back in history to, I always, when I want to answer a question like that, I always go digging in history. And I found the answer. You're not going to believe this. So it's universal healthcare, of course. It's Bernie Sanders, single payer plan. And there were all of these in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, all of these sort of latter-day populist types who proposed universal health care schemes. Unions proposed them. There was a doctor in Oklahoma, a very radical doctor, who proposed a system for his community, and they did it. It was him and the local farmers union set up a system in their town. And then the most interesting thing I discovered when I went to do this research is that, populism died out. The Populist Party died out in America in the 1890s, but it didn't die out in Canada. It kept going in the northern, the plains. Populism was big in the Dakotas, in Minnesota, in Kansas, obviously, Nebraska, and it also caught on in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and in Alberta, the plains provinces in Canada, and it kept going there, and they actually won. There was a party in Saskatchewan that was directly descended from the U.S. Populist Party, and they were called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. And you know what they invented? Universal health care.
Wow.
It caught on, and when they introduced it in 1962, now we're talking, this is these descendants of populism. In 1962, they introduced it in Saskatchewan, and the experts, the Canadian doctors, went on strike. So it was the war of populism versus the experts.
Mm.
And it was like Ayn Rand, right? The 1% went on strike, and the populists won, and all over Canada they embraced this system, and that's where Canadian healthcare comes from. So it's a really weird roundabout byproduct of populism, the original 1890s populism. Damn, we could use that here. We could use a taste of that right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be the perfect time for it. And going back to we've kind of gone up to the 30s, and now the next time period that you talk about kind of was the 60s. And I really thought that the MLK quote that you included about eating Jim Crow was very apt.
Yes, another great wordsmith, Martin Luther King. There's all of these wonderful people who have talked and written about populism, and I was surprised to learn that Martin Luther King not only he used the word populist, but he used it correctly. He did not use it in the Richard Hofstadter sense. He used it in the correct, actual historical sense of the term, and talked about how populism was beaten in the Deep South. The story that I told you earlier about how the disenfranchisement, that whole awful story. And he said that's where Jim Crow came from, and he was clinically correct. And what's fascinating to me is he said that in a very famous speech. You can watch it on YouTube at the conclusion of the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. It was in 1965. It was about a week before I was born when he gave that speech. And the funny thing is the man, it was a wonderful speech. You can see it on YouTube. Go back and look at it. He talks about the populist movement and how they were beaten, clearly drawing a historical connection between the movement he was leading, the civil rights movement, and the old populist movement. And a lot of other people drew that connection as well, a bunch of other writers in the 1960s. The irony, history is so ironic, is that the man who was sitting in the state capitol building at that moment, the asshole segregationist governor of Alabama, George Wallace, was by the end of the decade, that was the guy everybody was saying was the populist, not Martin Luther King and his friends and advisors, but their arch enemy. So
yeah, and it's just like when you don't have anything else, if you can look down on someone else, that's sometimes enough, I guess.
Yeah, it's absolutely. Yeah, you're talking about the famous quote about Jim Crow. Yeah,
I think Lyndon Johnson also had a quote like, if you can make the lowest white man feel like he's better than the lowest black man, then that's something. Exactly. You know what I mean? And that's what King was saying. That's how they beat. Yeah. Populism is about solidarity across races, working class solidarity across races. So if working people from all different races and walks of life get together, they can bring about, a democratic economy. That is my nutshell definition of populism. It's real simple. And King understood that and tried to build that kind of movement himself. And the response to that is, no, we're going to divide you by race. And white people, here's this system where, you may not be able to afford food. You may not be able to afford to get on a railroad train, but if you could, you'd get to ride in the car for white people, so there you go. And that was a strategy that defeated it. And so King understood that. Those are the two poles of our political life. Yeah. And I think you make an important point in the book too, that near the end of his life, MLK was very involved in economic issues, and he was definitely moving more in that range, because it was like you had the quote from him about, if you can't, what's the good of sitting in a lunch counter if you can't afford a hamburger and a coffee or whatever, it's like if you can't do anything while you get there, BFD, it's like
exactly. And so by the end of his life, he was trying to put together a movement for a march on Washington of poor people, and it didn't. He died before that. He was murdered while at a strike of trash collectors in Memphis.
Yeah.
While he was out there, showing solidarity with those guys and leading, trying to help them out. What we don't again, there's all of these sort of forgotten angles to American history. And by the way, I have to get off the phone here a minute and cook dinner for my dad.
Okay, absolutely. We can wrap it right. Sure.
We're in Kansas, so I'm going to be firing up a steak on the grill and
no doubt. That's awesome.
and, washing it down with a little bourbon and all that stuff. Very very populist dinner. But,
exactly. You're just a man of the people.
But King was very close with a lot of labor leaders, which I did not know, and spoke at unions all the time. And the unions also supported him and helped him out and were very close to him at the same time. And now we look back. Well, anyhow, it's all come apart. The wheels have really come off the liberal bus since then.
Okay, well, one more question about the book, and then I have one more question after that, and then I'll let you go. So you had to turn this in before you knew what was going to happen with the election, obviously. So now that it isn't Bernie Sanders, it's Joe Biden, and it appears that the Democrats are taking much the same tack they took in 2016 by going with the centrist
but Biden,
candidate. But do you see this turning out differently this time?
I think so. I don't see how because of the pandemic. So the pandemic, I had to turn this in, and then the pandemic hit, and I actually got it back in galleys so I could, make talk about make some reference to this pandemic and universal health care. But I don't see how a man, just in sheer practical terms, how a president bungles a crisis the way Trump has done and gets reelected. I don't see how that's possible. You've got unemployment is over 10% right now. People are desperate. They're going to, companies are going out of business. All these restaurants have gone under. You're going to see, this is a terrible, terrible time. And then not to mention, the police in Minneapolis murdering a guy in broad daylight, what the hell? I don't see how he gets reelected no matter who the Democrats nominate. Now, Biden is a centrist and has done a lot of really awful things in his time. But Biden is also definitely has a populist side to him. He has he is respectful of working people, which, put it this way, we got to wrap this up. Hillary's biggest gaffe was the deplorables remark. And the reason it was a gaffe was because white working class people thought it was aimed at them. They are very alert to any kind of expression of contempt like that. They already suspected that Hillary disdained them, regarded them with disdain, and that comment, even though she didn't mean it that way, seemed to nail that down. That is a mistake that Joe Biden will never make. He's he's very sensitive to issues like that. Now, he's been dreadful on like mass incarceration. This is the guy. If you want to blame any Democrat for mass incarceration, it's him. And write down the list. The trade agreements, the bankruptcy bill, and the Bush administration. Oh my God, this is all Biden.
Yeah, 94 crime bill, sure.
Yeah, but he is at least in rhetorically, he comes across as a respectful and a guy that you'd like to be friends with. Let's put it that way. So I don't think he will suffer the same fate as Hillary, but who knows? It's maybe Trump will pull off a miracle between now and then, and the coronavirus will go away, the economy will recover, but I don't see it happening.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, last question. I always ask this: what music you've been listening to lately?
Just before I picked up, we were listening to Duke Ellington. I'm introducing my dad to Spotify, and you can.
Cool.
It's like the research I'm telling you about. You can find anything on Spotify, and so I listen to a lot of that early jazz and big band stuff. I love Count Basie. I love Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw. But we were listening to Duke Ellington right before you called.
Cool. I've been listening. Actually, it's funny you say that. I've been listening to Jelly Roll Morton lately.
Oh, awesome! Yeah, the pianists from back then. Yes, yeah. I discovered. I love Spotify, but. I don't particularly like what's happening to artists, but I love that I can look up anything. There's all of these pianists who worked in the medium of the player piano. Do you know about this? And they would write music specifically for the player piano. Anyhow, we'll talk about that.
I had a player piano when I was a kid, but anyway, go on. We gotta talk again. You should come back on the podcast sometime.
Hey,
Thank you for doing this.
Anytime, absolutely.
Great. I wish you good health, and tell your family I said hello, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right, you got it, man.
Right, bye-bye. Hello and welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I'm of course your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 170th episode, our guest is Thomas Frank. Thomas Frank is the author of Listen, Liberal, Pity the Billionaire, The Wrecking Crew, and What's the Matter with Kansas? A former columnist for the Wall Street Journal and Harper's, Frank is the founding editor of The Baffler and writes regularly for The Guardian. He lives outside Washington, D.C. His new book, The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism, was published Tuesday. And now on to the show.